Moroi, Mambo, and hello. Last month, we're talking about March, the leaders of 44 African countries summited in the Rwandan capital of Kigali. Now, they signed what will probably become one of the world's largest free trade blocs agreement. Now, it's hoped that this deal, called the African Continental Free Trade Area, will be realized in 6 months. We're talking about increasing the prosperity for potentially 1.2 billion Africans. Now, the idea is that trade barriers would be removed, the likes of tariffs and import quotas, essentially allowing the free flow of goods and services between the members of this agreement. Now, in theory, that should boost commerce, growth, and employment. But let's emphasize there that that is in theory. I would like to introduce our panelists to you at this point in time. I have in the blue shirt here our favorite Ghanaian brother, Nish brother. I'm so used to speaking in church. We have Oheneba Boateng. By the way, these are all political scientists. But Oheneba Boateng has a very interesting take on this, and he is of the view that the African Continental Trade Agreement risks failing because it uses the, quote, the same bandwagon approach that African leaders have been using since the 1960s, right? I have here Harrison Mwilima from Tanzania, and he says, without strong political will, it's going to prove difficult to realize this initiative. Last but not least, we have the lady who hails from Nigeria, Lynda Iruolo, and she says that Africa, the continent, may be moving faster than its shadow with this agreement. So interesting ideas. I gathered from our our conversation before the camera started rolling that there is more skepticism than there is optimism about this. But let's get to the meat of this. Essentially, what will this translate into on the ground if this trade agreement goes ahead as planned?
So the leaders are actually talking about removing tariffs, right, within the African trading area. So they have removing tariffs that have been actually affecting traders within the region for a long time. So if this agreement comes into being, a Nigerian going to sell in Ghana or even in another region, let's say in South Africa, right, will not pay any tariffs on the services or the goods that they are selling in South Africa. Mm-hmm. The other aspect is also making it easier for people to go through custom processes. So exactly. These are now tariff barriers that also affect mm-hmm. people who conduct business within the continent. So they will make it easier for people to streamline the custom processes across the continent, maybe integrate them, so that it becomes easier for people to move across countries. Right?
Let's give this a bit of context. What are the existing realities as we speak? How difficult is it to trade on the continent as we speak?
African countries have been facing difficulties on trading with each other mm-hmm. as compared to trading with the outside world. And I think here we see the effects of colonialism, for example. Most of the African countries were connected very well to their former colonies. Mm-hmm. That means it's easier to trade with a former colonial power mm-hmm. or with the US compared to other African countries. And this has to do with there are different problems. The problem of infrastructure, for example. Sometimes it's very hard to get some products, for example, from Tanzania to somewhere maybe in South Sudan or in Sudan, or so the infrastructure is not very good. So this creates trade barriers. So if you are selling, for example, perishable goods, so by the time you transport them, let's say from Tanzania to another country, then you need a very long time, to so that these products can reach to the destination. And of course, there are some other challenges also which occurs in on trade again, especially when you think of these sub-regional groups. There are some countries, for example, East African Community. There are countries which they're supposed to open their market. They have already free trade area, they have customs union, but still, even with these initiatives, the trade is very low.
And this is why in your opening statement you alluded to the fact that if there isn't enough political will continent-wide, it's going to be very difficult to get this through. I think just
before you move on, we also need to take note of the fact that most of the countries produce maybe if not the same, similar kinds of primary goods, right? So it's very difficult to trade in the same things when you produce virtually the same type of items, right?
And this is where I'd like to come in 1 second, because just to that point, that becomes the issue of, is that potentially not the reason why intra-African trade, why Africans have been reluctant to trade amongst ourselves? If we're all producing the same thing, who wants to collapse whose market essentially? Is this what this speaks
that is part of the reason why we can't really trade among ourselves, you know. And this trade in primary goods is actually linked to another problem which comes from this same issue, that of tariffs or taxes, because we rely so much on primary goods. Many of our countries actually derive their income from taxes, right? So and taxes within Ghana, or tariffs across Africa and within the continent are higher than those that are imposed on items that are coming from outside of the continent, right? So, and I think that is because we exchange the same thing, right? So it's very difficult for us for the countries to diversify the economies, right, and trade in different items. So if we can't do a lot of business amongst ourselves, I think under the current conditions, the best idea, as happens now, is to increase tariffs to get more money from our neighbors, and I think that is why we have higher tariffs within the continent.
Okay.
Right? So that is another key challenge why we can't really trade.
I don't know if I really agree that we produce like the same things, because if you look at it, there's a map available of the manufacturing capability of Africa, and you can see that if you look at South Africa, they produce mostly minerals and stones, and then you have like Mali, Benin, who produce cotton. So in every region of Africa, there's something that they are particular about when it comes to production that we can also exchange between each other. But yes, you're right that there is a problem of diversification. But I think that I would lean more on Harrison's argument that it's a problem of colonialism, the fact that we've had these ties that we've been exporting the same things and outside to our colonial powers, and we've retained that method till today.
And that is because we all have the same thing. We are basically at least every former colony is given to their former colonizing power almost the same raw items that we have from Africa, right? So if we have the same thing, why are we going to exchange the same things among ourselves? We actually give it to people in Europe who need what we have.
No, but the thing is,
but just to clarify, I'm not saying that Nigeria has cocoa and Ghana has cocoa, and I'm saying primary goods, right? So different types of primary goods, right? So unless we can actually increase manufacturing capacity and then maybe establish regional value chains where we know that in Ghana, cotton, for instance, comes from Nigeria or any other country within the region that has the capacity to produce cotton, right? If there's no market for cotton within West Africa, they will be shipped to Europe, right?
No, but the thing is, there are different economic or trade theories you can apply here. That's why I suggest this political will. There is a way, for example, countries can decide. Well, a simple example is, for example, Tanzania and Kenya. For example, if Tanzania produces more coffee, and also Kenya produces tea better, Kenya does not have to produce coffee. I mean, Kenya can decide to let Tanzania, produce coffee, and then Kenya focus on tea, so as to use this comparative.
You are talking about what can be done. We are talking about what is.
Yeah, of course. That's why I'm saying I'm coming back to this
Political will.
Political will. You know, if some African leaders decide to sit together and to see how can we cooperate, you know, how can we trade together, you know, let's sit together and we see, you know.
On that note, I want to bring in the likes of Nigeria, and perhaps you can speak for your country. This is one of the countries that didn't initially get onto signing this agreement, and I wondered, could you explain what the reservations on the part of the Nigerian government were? Before you proceed.
I don't even know where to begin. Okay, I need to go back to the basics. So this agreement actually started way back in 1980s with the Lagos Plan of Action. And it was talked about again in Abuja Treaty in 1991. And you can see that these places were it was held in Lagos and Abuja, all in Nigeria. So they were like heralding this from the start. And already the president already made plans to be at that meeting. So it was cancelled 3 days before the agreement was signed. And the argument now, which from what I've read, is that the Nigerian Labour Council is saying, let me try and quote them correctly. They said that this is a renewable, extremely dangerous, radioactive, neoliberal policy initiative. That's your argument on this.
In layman's words, what does that mean?
In English.
So they are trying to say that, you know, it's a Western style of, you know, development initiative in Africa, which may not actually help us. And they're raising issues of competition that may not be good for local markets and people coming in from other countries and flooding the labor market in Nigeria. So which doesn't make sense to me because, you know, like we produce a lot of things, but you can also see that the standards are not great and the qualities are not good. And for them to improve, they need that competition. And I wonder why.
I see.
Okay. And I'm also surprised with President Buhari because he was supposed to be there in the first place and all of a sudden, like, he cancelled. Didn't he consult with stakeholders first? This is something he was supposed to do before actually telling them that he'll be there. So what's going on? Like,
what this expresses is the fact that, you know, there are voices in Nigeria who have probably gotten to the president's ear and said, look, we don't stand to benefit as much as others would, or we could benefit more from something like this. And I wondered, who are the beneficiaries of this agreement as it stands? Who stands to gain the most? Who would think this needs to happen? We can see the reluctance on the part of the Nigerians. And I can understand how every time we talk about this developing market in Africa, Nigeria is often quoted because of the numbers that Nigerians have. So I can see a lot of people, you know, entrepreneurs, businesses wanting to target the Nigerian economy because of the numbers that Nigeria has. So I mean, we see it with Dangote, for example. Isn't he the only person allowed to sell rice in the country, essentially? So to protect that particular market, for example. So I wanted to know, okay, who then stands to benefit the most? Are we talking countries? Are we talking sectors? And is it as simple as that?
Yeah, and I think first of all, to the question of Nigeria again, I think at some point the Nigerians would sign this agreement. Yeah. And some of the reasons which also Buhari talked about is also he has to consult. I mean, he has this document has to be seen.
But she gave the timeline.
Which is what I'm angry about because this should have been done before.
Yes.
Yeah, it should have been done before. But I think, and this is again connecting to the point who is going to stand. I think the ones who actually stopped Buhari, they're the business groups. Yeah, business people, and these are the people who want to see how exactly they can benefit from this agreement. Yeah, in details, how they can really benefit from this. So, and that's why I think here again the importance of bringing private sector in. Yeah, private sector.
So, are you saying this was agreed upon among politicians and business industry was not necessarily consulted? As a result, that same sector has.
Who is doing trade? Are they politicians? It's the private sector, the people.
But do we know that industry was not consulted, that this was done exclusively
that's
by
what it looks like.
That's what it looks like. And I think that's the case of Nigeria. And again, also, South Africa, I think they still, I mean, they're in, but they still question this agreement. They still want to talk with their people, with the private sector, to see how they can benefit from this. And then agree on this. And also this agreement also has to be ratified by most of the
national
national parliaments.
Okay, so I mean, one of the questions we're going to discuss today is where are the problem areas, and I think that would be a fundamental thing. If we know that politicians sat in a room and did not necessarily consult the very people that make this happen. And somebody mentioned before we started rolling the cameras that much of the industry on the continent is small businesses.
Yes, about 80% of them are small to medium scale, businesses. So, according to the document that I've seen,
yes,
this number of businesses are supposed to be the beneficiaries if they have the capacity to scale up their operations within their regions and across the continent. So to me, it comes down to a question of capacity. Do we have the businesses, the African brands that can actually cross borders,
exactly, yeah.
Or do we just have businesses that are trying to survive just at the level of survival, even within their own countries, So in as much as, in principle, this is a good idea to open the borders for African businesses to thrive within the continent, I'm wondering if those who are supposed to benefit, which actually constitute the majority of people in this sector, whether they can actually take advantage of these opportunities.
And you had mentioned earlier that you actually felt that it's potentially the big multinationals, which tend to be foreign companies anyway, that would benefit most from.
Yeah, because most of them have subsidiaries operating in these African countries, right? And one of the headaches that they have is the tariff barriers that exist within Africa. Because, when you are dealing with Africa, you are dealing with about 55 different countries, which have perhaps different tariff regimes, unless you trade within a certain sub-region which may have an integrated customs system like in SACU, then you're okay. But if you are dealing with individual countries, it's a headache, right? So for multinationals who have the capacity to trade across countries, this is going to be a very good opportunity for them to scale up their operations and their products across all these countries. Right?
Because small businesses don't have the capacity.
Small businesses don't have the capacity.
I want to bring the lady in because you made a very interesting point in your statement. You say that Africa might be moving faster than its shadow. Could you elaborate on what exactly you were getting at with that?
Like, I would want to go back to his statement about political will, because anytime I hear political will, I feel like it's all about African leaders coming together and signing documents. And we've been doing that for decades. Like, we come together, we are all enthusiastic, and we write up these treaties and we sign them. We don't waste any time. We don't waste any time in signing these documents. But then implementing them is a problem. So we are trying to, get to the point where we have liberalized markets, no visa restrictions, and all that, and single currency, for instance. And this is where, like, the European Union has found itself, and it took it like about 5 decades to get there. And we're trying to do this in less time. And going back to my statement about it moving faster than its shadows, I feel that, there are still things we have to tackle, especially all boils down to governance issues. Political sector, when you look at corruption and the fact that moving goods from one region to the other, you may encounter several blockages.
Yes.
And then you have to face, corrupt officials who would tax you a lot for those goods, which is outside of the taxes
that you already have to pay.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you have the issue of visa restrictions that, it's surprising to me that a French person can easily move around Africa compared to me, a Nigerian, things like that. And then you go to the socioeconomic issue, infrastructure, transport. We don't have good roads and transportation to move these goods. Our ports are not great. We talk about electricity. Like, less than 30% of Africans can actually access electricity. Internet, we're still getting. So you see that, like, we haven't even gotten to the point where we should be enforcing the FTA. It's a good dream.
But can I come in there? But okay, you're saying you brought electricity, and I want to talk to Nigeria, for example. This is Nigeria has failed on the part of electricity.
Yeah.
Would something like this not help Nigeria? Because maybe a business in another country on the continent who can bring electricity to Nigeria is now able to access that market and do business accordingly. Or is that not necessarily the same thing? But what you're saying, you're talking about long term. You're saying lay the infrastructure. We know that takes years before we can even be talking about even having the conversation about potentially trading.
Yeah, but I feel like we should. There is a level that we should get to before we can talk about FTA, and we're not there yet.
That actually connects to the point I was trying to raise with the statement. Seriously, I think that not all African countries should be part of this agreement, right?
Which ones should be excluded?
Let me explain. Of course, let me explain. I think there are too many countries at a time, expressing interest and, signing, indicating that they really want to be part of it. But the problem is that as we saw with the Lagos Plan of Action and the African Economic Community Act in 1991, we've attempted this before, where all the countries signed these documents, but nothing happened, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that is because we usually... This is a big problem with African cooperation or integration. We usually want everyone to be a part of the process. Instead of setting minimum requirements for countries to meet before they become a part of a certain agreement or a certain project.
Point, yeah.
We just want everyone to be part of it because we think we are Pan-Africanists and every problem has to be addressed in a Pan-African way where every country on the continent is part of it. But if you do that, you're actually working against integration, right? Because for integration really to work, countries need to make credible commitments, which they show in their policies, right? For far too long, we've been counting and relying on political will, and at this point, you should know that you cannot rely on political will, which is just an individual leader or a group of people in government deciding whether they should do this or that, But if, for instance, if this agreement requires that before you join, you should have granted visa-free travel, you should have done this, you should have done that, you should have at least, there are certain thresholds that you have to meet before you become a part of it.
Okay. That's part of the political will. Yeah. I mean,
so the point is, so the point I'm making is, if you don't meet this requirement, you are not part of it.
Yeah.
Right. So any country that becomes a part of it shows that they are serious by meeting these requirements.
Yeah.
But what we have now,
a free for all.
It's free for all. It's like admitting someone into a university and then telling the person that, okay, now that you are here, you can start working on meeting the entry requirements. This is what we are doing now, and I think it's not working.
So you're saying we need a more pragmatic approach to these things, and not in the interest of just portraying to the world that Africa is uniting, but there has to be some practical, and I think that makes a lot of sense. You express some reluctance to some of the things that he's saying.
The thing is, when you look at the African history and you look at how African countries always come together, this sense of Pan-Africanism is very strong in African countries. And that's why I think this having an agreement that everybody signs and then we start working on things could be the way. Because sometimes if you just say you have to fulfill this and this and that, then it may not be the case. You may have to eliminate some other countries.
But that's the point of integration.
Yeah, coming again back to this political will. Yeah, political will. It also means that when you sign this agreement, then you have to be willing to do what this agreement requires.
How many times haven't we tried that?
Look, the thing is, we don't have. There's some people who are criticizing anyway this model of free trade area. I mean, there's some people who are saying this is like copy and paste of European Union. This worked in Europe. Maybe might not be the case in Africa. Even when you look at at their rhetorics in this agreement, they talk about, so we are having free trade, and then the next should be customs union, and then common market. And Ramaphosa said we also need common currency. So it's like really taking the steps the Europeans have taken, and we are living in a very different context. And for me, for example, this regional economic cooperation does not have to be based on this functional starting from free trade area, customs union, and common market, but it can also be cooperation based also a development cooperation, means like the issue you mentioned about electricity. It can be like development in a way that, for example, nowadays there are some transport corridors, or we still have some porous borders. There are some countries, for example, maybe for some regions in Tanzania, it's easy to get electricity from Kenya than from the main station in Tanzania. So why don't these parts, cooperate? So not necessarily doing trade, but also it can also take this form of developmental type of cooperation. And of course, this trade also has to come in afterwards.
Part of that is already happening. Ghana sells electricity to Togo, and we've been doing that for a long time. And if we can count this as part of integration, there's
at least developmental, type.
Yeah, I understand. And so there's some of that happening. People are already working across borders.
Or the corridors, the transport corridors.
The relationship between Nollywood and Ghana, for instance, that has been going on for about 2 decades now. It's not funny. That has been going on for about 2 decades now, right? There are women in Ghana who go to Nigeria, go to Togo to bring goods from this country. So something is happening already. But as we've seen with this proposal now, these people that are, operating at this small scale level do not even seem to be reflected in this agreement. I hope with the subsequent protocols that they will sign, they will actually bring in these specific groups. But at the moment, it doesn't look like that. But for me, when you talk about Pan-Africanism and ensuring that everyone is a part of it, I think that can be the basis for all cooperation, but that should not be the only criteria we have, because everyone can be Pan-Africanist, right? But how do you show that there is really the interest to integrate your activities and your
political will?
I don't know. So seriously, for me, there is a difference between Pan-Africanism and integration. Integration is a serious business.
But on this point, I want to bring in the element coming back to the existing FTA or free trade agreement. What kind of not coping mechanisms, but compliance mechanisms are in this? You talked about the fact that we have high taxes or tariffs existing on the continent, but you find when you get to a place, you might have corrupt officials who ask you to pay more. So what kind of mechanisms does this current agreement have to make sure that those who sign up will comply?
I don't think it does. It does have any mechanism at the moment.
So there are no compliance mechanisms.
So
there's no way of ascertaining whether or not the Tanzanians are playing.
What they just did was sign.
They're yet to introduce the individual protocol. So I think that's where they will introduce the compliance mechanisms.
So they just ratified the treaty. The next thing now is to bring it into force, which I feel like it's a groom going to a parent's family and saying, "No, I want to marry your daughter," without bringing the bride price yet. So we are still waiting for the bride price to come. So they have ratified it. We're now waiting for the number of countries to make this come into force. And then after we talk about negotiations. So
but in terms of compliance mechanisms, how best do you ensure that everybody is doing their part? What kind of things do we need to see? Because you're saying that there should be some requirements before people can get access. It looks like it's going the other way, where everybody can sign, but now that we're here, how do we ensure that everybody is playing their part?
I think one of the major issues is to revise some internal regulations. That's why there is this issue that this agreement has to be ratified by the national parliaments. That means if there is a regulation that you take a certain revenue, a certain tariff from products from outside countries, then you have to revise those regulations, and those are the mechanisms. So if a country revises those regulations, to give a space that other products from other African countries may enter the country freely, then I think that's the mechanisms which can use. But the mechanisms have to go first of all through the parliaments, and the regulations have to be revised. And I think.
And then after that, I would suggest that they have the African peer review mechanism. Why not use it?
Exactly.
So tell them to review these states. If they have ticked off everything that they need to do, then they are allowed to join the FTA. If not, they should still keep working until they get there.
I was actually thinking about this, that why don't we link this project to the APRM?
Yes.
Right. So countries that have met some of these governance benchmarks, will be the only ones that will be graduated into this program. Yeah. Otherwise, Harrison, we've been doing this for a long time. If you allow every country to be part of it, some countries just seem to enjoy the company of the other countries. So they will definitely want to be a part of it. But as to domesticating these policies, it doesn't happen.
You can have criteria. We have seen criteria here in the EU. Before the countries had to join the monetary union, there were criteria. But for example, Greece lied.
And what happened to Greece?
And now they're in crisis.
Exactly. That's the point. If you don't do what you said you will do, there are consequences. That's the point.
But if a country wants to get in, they can do whatever they want. Look, for example.
That is why you have admission requirements to go to school.
And
but you mess up, you are suspended, or you are
but you can pretend to be a good student, but then you.
But now we have the African peer review mechanism, which the EU doesn't have. So let's make use of it.
You see,
look, the EU has, for example, this criteria for joining the EU. You have to revise your human rights. Your democracy. Countries are revising, but then they enter, and then they go back to the business as usual. So, and I think this would also be the case, for example, in the African country. We can have criteria. Look at the example, for example, East African Community. When you look at their documents, they're supposed to have customs union, they're supposed to have common market. They have agreed this, and you find this in papers. But when you look, we still have trade wars, for example, between Tanzania and Kenya. Because there's some products the countries still want to protect.
Because the countries are like-minded. They have the same attitude, right? And these are let's also look at the structure of integration on the continent. Our approach has been governments trying to run the show instead of giving the process to an independent or a supranational organization that can actually operate and impose sanctions. Right?
Forget about that in Africa.
So we don't have that. We have governments who always try to impose integration, from above. Right. If a group of presidents meet to agree on this, the criteria and everything, and they are not willing to operate by them, we are not going anywhere. So to me, in terms of this agreement, I think we can link that to the APRM, right, and let it operate. Give it to a different agency of the African Union. And let that agency operate on a serious basis. Give it legal powers to impose sanctions, to demand a credible commitment from the countries, right?
And independent institutions.
So that is the problem we have. So the problem is actually with the leaders that are not willing to really. That are not willing. No, seriously. That are not willing to give their agencies enough power. To actually do the things that will bring about closer cooperation among the countries. So to me, not every country should be a part of this agreement.
I totally agree.
It should be those who have not those who want to be, but those who have shown that they are actually serious. Those are the countries that should be.
But look at most of the regional organizations in Africa. Most of them are operating based on a very intergovernmental type of management.
Yeah.
Most of the commissions, you look at the commissions, they are not independent enough to do whatever they want. Most of the time, the power still lies on the government.
So you are agreeing with me? You agree with my point?
Yeah, no, that's why I'm saying if countries decide really to pursue this without the will to say, so in this sense I agree with you, without the will to say, now we are serious about this and we decide to give like an independent body.
So your problem is with the political will, just...
No. But
you just want to bring back the point to political will.
I would like for us to wrap up at this stage. But I think we can all agree that if this could be something that could work really well.
Yes.
But not under the existing conditions. Yeah. It can't be business as usual. That the approach has to be different. That this is not necessarily something like this. Shouldn't just be about brand Pan-Africanism, but it really needs to translate. And I got the sense from Lynda when she gave when she said, we're going a bit ahead of ourselves here. That some basics needs to be put in order. We talked about the fact that we have these small businesses on the continent who are barely surviving within their domestic areas. That kind of business is now supposed to be able to go and sell across the borders, yet they can barely survive in the community. So there's some things that need to be done. But I wonder what your final thoughts are as we bring this to a close, and where should we start in terms of wrapping this up? Just your final contribution as the political leaders who are still pretty much in charge, mull over this and bring us closer to realizing this agreement. Lynda, should we start with you?
Yeah, I can begin. Before I go into that, I would like to say that, we should also take account of the challenge that, the case of the EU is having right now, that the bigger states, the more industrialized states, are benefiting more from the FTA than the weaker states. So leaders should think about how should we overcome that challenge, because many weak states in Africa don't have that manufacturing capability, and this is what we should think about. And I would also say, like we've already spoken on the fact that they should put in the basics first. They should bring in the APRN to review people and let people come in batch by batch and not have everybody join at the same time. And I think that we've all agreed that integration seems like it's coming from above. And we have stakeholders that leaders should talk to.
Exactly.
If Buhari, for instance, spoke to his stakeholders, he wouldn't have a situation where he's cancelling meetings 3 days before the meeting holds. So we should bring in our stakeholders, make sure we talk to them, let them know the pros and the cons of this and how we can go about it before we can push forward.
Harrison?
Yeah, I think on my side, I agree with many things you said, and in addition to that, I think it's very, very important to include the private sector in this whole project, because they're the ones who are doing business. So before ratifying this, I think it could be very important. Each country brings together its private sector. At least they should have their own platform to see what's going on with this agreement and to see how they can stand to benefit from this agreement, because otherwise we may still have the same problem like we experienced in the sub-regional groups. You have free trade, but you cannot use it. You have customs union, but you cannot use it. Why? Because people are not very well prepared. So the private sector should be prepared, and all the people who are involved in trade, in business, should be prepared. And they should, I think the politicians should let them also put their recommendations in all these agreements. And that's why I think this is the case for Nigeria again, and the case for South Africa, wanting consultation with their stakeholders, and I think this should be also applied to other African countries.
All right. Oheneba?
Yeah, for me, I think we should invest in infrastructure, especially take control of our transportation. Our transportation routes. I always give this example. Some people don't really think it's that exciting, but before the arrival of the Europeans, in Africa, you realize that many of the African kingdoms that actually built strong structures were those that were able to control trade routes. trade across the continent, It changed when the Europeans came and directed trade from the hinterland towards the coast, towards the high seas, where the Europeans, they controlled the high seas. And that's where they made the money. So if you don't have the infrastructure to move goods and services around, right, it's going to be very, very, very difficult. So infrastructure is key. It's very important. And that is why I think we should link that to the APRM to demand that countries put certain structures, some minimum structures in place before they become a part of this, agreement.
And I think also investing in the manufacturing sector, I think it's about
Sure,
We've been
sure.
having this diversification conversation, and the numbers are still telling us that Africans, we are still exporting raw materials more than anything. We've been surviving that way, and we've not invested in our manufacturing sectors. Those have been essentially annihilated in many countries. And now we're sitting with an opportunity to send goods over to the next country, but actually we have nothing to send over because we don't make anything. We'll leave it here for now, and of course the discussion will continue. You can get in touch with us via the comment section. You can also write to us on our Facebook page. You can reach us on Twitter, essentially. But I wanted to leave everyone with these numbers, very sobering numbers that you can think of. So we're talking about intra-continental trade. If we compare the statistics with Asia and Europe, we see that in Asia, 51% of trade is intra-continental, so that's within the continent. In the case of Europe, it's 70%. In Africa, just 16%.
So there's work to do.
Lots of work to be done.